Act 1 ended with a decision. Macbeth agreed to murder King Duncan. Now comes the moment that everything changes. Act 2 is where Macbeth crosses the line he can never uncross. The murder happens, the guilt begins, and Shakespeare starts showing us that getting what you want isn't always the same thing as being happy. So let's break down Act 2, scene by scene. Act 2 is probably the most important act of the entire play. Everything before Act 2 is temptation. Everything after Act 2 is consequence. If Act 1 asks whether Macbeth will commit the murder, Act 2 shows us what's happening when it actually does. The journey of this act is very straightforward. Macbeth sees a dagger, he murders Duncan, immediately begins falling apart psychologically, murder is discovered, Scotland descends into chaos. By the end of the act, Macbeth has achieved his goal, but he has already started paying the price. The first scene opens late at night. Banquo and his son Fleance are walking through the castle. Something feels wrong. Banquo admits he cannot sleep. Notice what Shakespeare is doing here. Before the murder even happens, the atmosphere itself is tense. Everybody is unsettled. It's almost as if the castle itself knows something terrible is about to happen. Banquo mentions the witches. Macbeth immediately lies. He says he hasn't been thinking about them. Now we know as an audience that's nonsense. Macbeth has been obsessing over the prophecies ever since he heard it. This is one of the first moments where Macbeth starts performing a false version of himself. He's already becoming someone who hides the truth. When Macbeth is alone, we then have one of the most famous Shakespearean speeches. Macbeth sees a dagger floating in front of him. He asks, "Is this a dagger which I see before me?" Imagine how frightening that would be. Macbeth is walking towards Duncan's room. He's nervous, he's conflicted, and suddenly his mind begins creating terrifying images. This speech gives us direct access to Macbeth's thoughts in this moment. One of the reasons examiners love this scene is because there isn't one correct answer. Maybe the dagger is supernatural. The witches are pushing Macbeth towards this, influencing him. Or maybe Shakespeare wants us to see Macbeth as being drawn towards his fate. Maybe it's his own guilt creating this. The important thing to understand is Shakespeare deliberately leaves the question open. Now something really interesting happens. The most important event of the entire play happens off stage. We never actually see Duncan being killed, and why? Because Shakespeare knows our imagination is often more powerful than anything he could show us. Instead of watching the murder, we focus on its consequence, and that's where the real tragedy begins. When Macbeth returns, he's completely shaken. This isn't brave warrior Macbeth from Act 1, he's terrified. One of the first things he says is, "I could not say Amen." To a Jacobean audience, this is a huge warning sign. Macbeth already feels cut off from God. He feels spiritually damaged by what he has done. Then Macbeth thinks he hears a voice. The voice cries, "Macbeth does murder sleep." This is one of Shakespeare's most important symbols, sleep. It represents peace, innocence, rest. Macbeth has destroyed his own ability to enjoy these things, and throughout the rest of the play, he will never truly find peace again. Macbeth looks at the blood on his hands and he asks, Will all great Neptune's oceans wash this blood clean from my hand? The answer is obviously no. This isn't really about physical blood, it's about guilt. Macbeth already realises that what happened cannot be erased. The blood becomes a symbol that again will follow him throughout the rest of the play. Now compare Macbeth to Lady Macbeth. Macbeth thinks the blood can never be removed. Lady Macbeth says, "A little water clears us of this deed." At this moment she appears much stronger, much calmer and much more practical. But Shakespeare is setting up an interesting contrast, because later in the play those roles will reverse. Lady Macbeth also maintains control throughout this scene, whereas Macbeth increasingly falls apart, to the point where Lady Macbeth chastises him, demanding, did he leave the daggers? Did he put the blood on the guards as their plan stated? And he does not. So Lady Macbeth goes off and she covers the guards in blood and returns, thinking their plan is complete. Then suddenly we hear knocking. It interrupts this and it gets louder. Think about what Shakespeare is doing. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have been trapped in their own world. Now reality is knocking. The outside world is demanding answers. The Porter scene often confuses many students. Why include comedy after a murder? The answer is simple. Shakespeare gives us an audience a moment to breathe. But there's also another layer. The Porter jokes about being the gatekeeper of hell, and symbolically, that's exactly what the castle has become, a place where evil has entered. The knocking is Macduff. Macduff enters and discovers Duncan's body, and suddenly everything explodes into chaos. The castle is filled with panic, shock, fear. Notice how quickly the consequences have arrived. Macbeth wanted power. Now we are surrounded by suspicion. Macbeth claims he kills Duncan's guards and servants because he was overwhelmed with grief. How could they let this happen to their king? But should we believe him? Probably not. By killing the guards, he removes people who might defend themselves. It's a clever move, but it also draws suspicion. Shakespeare wants us to start questioning Macbeth's explanations. Duncan's sons decide to run away. They know someone has murdered their father, and they fear they could be next. Unfortunately, their decision creates a problem, because fleeing makes them look guilty, and that helps Macbeth. The final scene shifts away from the castle. Ross discusses strange events happening across Scotland. Darkness appears during the day. Animals are behaving unnaturally. Horses are turning on one another. To a Jacobean audience, this was hugely important because nature itself seems to react to Duncan's murder. The natural order has been broken. Look at Macbeth now compared to the beginning of the play. He started as Scotland's greatest hero. Now he's a murderer consumed by fear and guilt. Meanwhile, Lady Macbeth still appears strong and in control. But Shakespeare is quietly planting the seeds of her future collapse. If you're revising Act 2, these are some quotations that I would recommend that you learn. You do not need to learn all of them, but they are great for crossing over multiple themes and symbols and motifs. We have the dagger, amen, sleep no more, Neptune's oceans, a little water, and daggers in men's smiles. I would recommend we learn where they happen, understand why they matter, and you'll be able to use them across multiple different essay questions. If I had to summarise Act 2 in one sentence, it would be this. Macbeth achieves his ambition by murdering Duncan, but immediately begins suffering the psychological consequences of his actions. The crown is now within reach, but Macbeth isn't happy. He's frightened, he's guilty, and he becomes increasingly dangerous. In Act 3, Macbeth becomes king, but instead of finding peace, he discovers that power creates a brand new problem: paranoia. And that's where the real downfall begins.